Ezra Whitmore's weathered hand froze mid-reach for his wallet, the auctioneer's hammer suspended in dusty Austin air. The child labor auction had been proceeding as expected until this moment, broken souls sold like cattle to the highest bidder. The 14-year-old girl wasn't cowering like the others. Sheriff Morrison's coffee cup clattered to the warehouse floor, hot liquid splashing across his boots. 36 men shifted uncomfortably as those fierce green eyes swept across them with calculating precision, as if memorizing every face for future reckoning. Catherine Whitmore clutched her husband's arm, remembering her own lost daughter who would have been this age. The girl's defiant chin reminded her of dreams buried 15 years deep in hill country soil. $50, Ezra heard himself call out, though his mind screamed warnings. Something about this child promised trouble, the dangerous kind that changed everything. Who was she really, and what secrets burned behind those unnaturally intelligent eyes? In that suffocating warehouse, destiny disguised itself as a simple transaction. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The Whitmore Ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of hill country limestone and stubborn mesquite, a testament to 20 years of backbreaking labor and stubborn pride. Ezra had built it from nothing after the war, when land was cheap and hope was cheaper. Now, at 42, he stood on his wraparound porch each morning surveying an empire that felt hollow as a dried gourd. Catherine emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 38, she still carried herself with the purposeful grace of a woman accustomed to life-and-death decisions, though those days as a Civil War nurse felt like another lifetime. Her blonde hair, now threaded with premature silver, caught the morning light as she studied her husband's rigid shoulders. "That dog won't hunt," she murmured, recognizing the set of his jaw. 15 years of marriage had taught her to read his silences like scripture. The truth that gnawed at both their hearts remained unspoken between them. 15 years of trying, 15 years of hope dying with each monthly reminder of their failure. Catherine kept the tiny yellow dress folded in cedar, never worn, never would be. Ezra had stopped mentioning the ranch hand's children, stopped planning for a legacy that would die with him. What Catherine didn't know was that Ezra had been drinking bitter root tea for 3 years now, an old Comanche remedy that ensured no child would carry what he believed was cursed blood. His father had died mad, raving about voices in the walls. His grandfather had put a shotgun to his own head rather than face another winter of despair. Some legacies, Ezra reasoned, deserved to end. The hill country stretched endlessly around their ranch, limestone bluffs rising like ancient fortresses against a sky that promised another scorching day. Longhorn cattle dotted the pastures, their massive horns catching sunlight like polished bone. This was good land, hard-won land, but it demanded everything from those who claimed it. In town, whispers followed the Whitmores like dust devils, the barren couple, the childless rancher whose name would die with him. Catherine bore it with the same stoic grace she'd shown during the war, but Ezra saw how her hands shook when she passed the schoolhouse, heard the catch in her breathing when neighbor children visited. The drought of '85 had been merciless, forcing desperate families to make choices that would have been unthinkable in better times. Children sold into labor, families scattered like tumbleweeds, hope rationed like precious water. It was this desperation that had driven Ezra to the Austin labor auction, though he told himself he only needed ranch help. But when he'd seen Grace Sullivan on that platform, thin as a rail, eyes burning with intelligence that seemed far older than her 14 years, something had stirred in his chest that felt dangerously close to paternal instinct. Those weren't the vacant stares of a broken child. This girl was calculating, watching, planning. She reminded him of Catherine during the war, someone who had learned to survive by being smarter than those who would destroy her. Now, as dust clouds announced an approaching rider, Ezra wondered if $50 had bought them salvation or damnation. Grace Sullivan arrived at the Whitmore Ranch like a wild Mustang, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable. The wagon ride from Austin had been 20 miles of careful silence, broken only by Ezra's attempts at conversation that died against the girl's calculating stare. She sat rigid beside him, her thin frame alert to every sound, every movement, as if expecting attack from any direction. The main house rose before them in the late afternoon sun, its timber walls weathered silver gray by hill country storms. Catherine appeared on the porch, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. At first glance, Grace seemed fragile, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, her brown hair hanging in tangles that spoke of months without proper care. But her eyes told a different story. They moved constantly, cataloging exits, measuring distances, noting the location of every window and door. "Welcome home, child," Catherine said softly, stepping forward with maternal instincts that had lain dormant too long. Grace's response chilled both adults to the bone. "How many ways out of this house?" she asked matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. The first weeks brought a series of unsettling discoveries. Grace ate sparingly, testing each bite of food as if expecting poison. She slept on the floor beside her bed rather than in it, and Catherine often found her standing at windows in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the horizon with military precision. Most disturbing was her knowledge, medical knowledge that no 14-year-old should possess. When one of Ezra's prize bulls gored itself on barbed wire, Grace appeared with needle and thread before anyone could summon the veterinarian from town. Her small hands worked with surgical precision, cleaning the wound and stitching with techniques that made Catherine's nursing experience seem elementary. "Where did you learn to do that?" Catherine whispered, watching the girl's steady fingers. Grace paused in her work, those green eyes meeting Catherine's with uncomfortable directness. "Dr. Blackwood taught me. Said healing hands were God's gift, but sometimes God needed help deciding who deserved saving." The name meant nothing to them then, but Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach. She recognized the flat tone, the mechanical way Grace spoke of medical procedures. During the war, she'd seen soldiers with that same detachment, men who had been forced to make too many life-and-death decisions before their hearts could handle the weight. Ezra found Grace in his study one evening, poring over his medical texts by lamplight. She read Latin as easily as English, her finger tracing anatomical diagrams with disturbing familiarity. When he asked where she'd learned such things, she simply said, "The White Room. We studied there every day." The nightmares began in her third week. Catherine would wake to screams echoing through the house, raw, animal sounds that spoke of unspeakable terror. She'd find Grace huddled in the corner of her room, shaking violently, speaking in medical terminology about procedures and subjects and necessary sacrifices for the greater good. During these episodes, Grace would revert to someone else entirely. Her posture changed, becoming rigid and formal. She would recite information in a monotone voice. Pulse rates, blood pressure measurements, surgical techniques for operations no child should know existed. Catherine began sleeping with her door open, maternal instincts warring with growing dread about what kind of hell this girl had escaped. Marcus Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday, Ezra's younger brother riding in with the casual confidence of a man who belonged everywhere he went. Tall and lean with their father's dark hair, Marcus had always been the charming one, the easy talker who could sell cattle to vegetarians. But when he met Grace, something shifted in his expression. "Interesting choice of help, brother," Marcus said that first evening, his eyes never leaving Grace as she served dinner with silent efficiency. "She's not help," Ezra replied firmly. She's family now." Marcus's laugh held no warmth. "Family. Ezra, do you know what that girl is? Look at her hands, steady as a surgeon's. Look at how she moves, like she's memorizing every inch of this place for future reference. That's not an orphan you rescued. That's a weapon someone trained." Catherine's fork clattered against her plate. She'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't dared voice it. Grace's knowledge was too extensive, too specialized. Her survival skills too refined for a child who claimed to have lived on Austin's streets for mere months. That night, after Grace had retired to her room, Catherine found Ezra on the porch, staring out at stars that offered no answers. "Marcus might be right," she whispered. "There's something she's not telling us." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Then we'll wait until she's ready to tell us. That girl has been through hell, Catherine. Maybe she's not ready to trust us with the whole truth yet." Neither of them noticed Grace standing in the shadows by the kitchen door, listening to every word with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that survival depended on knowing exactly what people said when they thought she couldn't hear. The breaking point came on a sweltering August morning when Grace collapsed in the barn, her body convulsing as memories clawed their way to the surface like demons escaping hell. Catherine found her there, curled against a feed barrel, speaking in that flat, mechanical voice that had haunted their nights. Subject 7 responded poorly to the iron solution. "Dr. Blackwood says we must try again tomorrow. The greater good requires sacrifice." Grace's eyes stared at nothing, pupils dilated with terror. "I must remember the measurements. Lives depend on precision." Catherine knelt beside the trembling girl, her nursing instincts overriding fear. "Grace, honey, you're safe. You're at the ranch. There's no Dr. Blackwood here." The name triggered something violent in Grace's expression. She grabbed Catherine's wrist with surprising strength, her small fingers finding pressure points with disturbing accuracy. "Dr. Cornelius Blackwood saved us from the streets. Fed us, clothed us, gave us purpose. We are his children now, his instruments of healing." The words poured out like poison from a lanced wound. Grace spoke of a medical facility disguised as an orphanage, where children were trained as unwilling assistants in experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. She described rooms where desperate parents brought sick children, paying enormous sums for miracle cures that often proved more deadly than the original ailments. "He called it God's work," Grace whispered, her voice breaking back into that of a frightened child. "Said we were chosen to help perfect the human form, that our suffering would save countless others." Catherine's blood turned to ice water. During the war, she'd heard whispers of such places, facilities that operated beyond the reach of law, where medicine became torture and healing became horror. She'd dismissed them as wartime rumors, but Grace's detailed knowledge painted a picture too specific, too terrible to be fabricated. Ezra appeared in the barn doorway, drawn by the sound of distress. When Grace saw him, she tried to retreat further into the shadows, but Catherine held her gently. "Tell us about Dr. Blackwood," Catherine said softly. "What did he look like?" Grace's description chilled them both. A tall, elegant man with silver hair and surgeon's hands who spoke of divine purpose while conducting procedures that would have made battlefield medics weep. He claimed to be developing treatments for infertility, using orphaned children as test subjects for compounds and techniques that promised to perfect God's greatest miracle, the creation of life. "He said I was special," Grace continued, her voice barely audible. "That my blood held secrets others didn't possess. That's why he kept me closest, taught me the most. He said one day I would help him create perfect children, children who would never suffer as I had suffered." The implications hit Ezra like a physical blow. This monster wasn't just experimenting on children, he was obsessed with fertility, with reproduction, with the very thing that had driven Ezra to that auction in Austin. The timing felt too convenient, too calculated. Grace, Ezra said carefully, how many children were at this facility? Dozens came and went? Most didn't last long. The weak ones died during procedures, and the strong ones— She paused, struggling with memory. The strong ones were sent away when they got too old, too questioning. Dr. Blackwood said they went to good families, but I saw the graves behind the main building, saw him burning clothes that belonged to children who supposedly found new homes. Catherine's hands shook as she processed the magnitude of what Grace was describing. This wasn't just medical malpractice. This was systematic murder disguised as charity, a network of death funded by desperate parents and enabled by corrupt officials. "How did you escape?" Ezra asked. Grace's eyes grew distant. "There was a fire. Started in the laboratory wing during one of Dr. Blackwood's late-night procedures. In the confusion, some of us ran. I made it to Austin, but the others—" She didn't finish, but her silence spoke volumes. That evening, after Grace had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Catherine paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Everything made sense now. The girl's medical knowledge, her hypervigilance, her inability to trust. She'd been trained as a child soldier in a war against innocence itself. "We have to protect her," Catherine said fiercely. "If this Dr. Blackwood is still alive, if he's still operating, he'll come for her." Ezra nodded grimly. Marcus was right about one thing. She is a weapon, but not by choice. That bastard turned a child into something she never should have become. As if summoned by his words, Marcus appeared at the kitchen door, his usually jovial expression replaced by something darker. "Brother, we need to talk. I've been asking questions in Austin about your girl, and the answers aren't pretty." He stepped inside, removing his hat with unusual formality. "Dr. Cornelius Blackwood isn't just some quack doctor operating in shadows. He's got connections that reach all the way to Washington, federal contracts for medical research, political protection that makes him untouchable through normal channels." Catherine felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "What kind of connections?" "The kind that make orphaned children disappear without paperwork, that ensure investigations get buried before they start. The kind that could make a small ranch in hill country vanish overnight if the right people decide it's become inconvenient." Ezra's jaw set with dangerous determination. Then we'll have to make sure they never get the chance." Outside, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky, and none of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line. A figure who'd been tracking Grace Sullivan for 3 long months, waiting for the perfect moment to complete Dr. Blackwood's most important work. The turning point had arrived, though they wouldn't recognize it until blood had been spilled and choices made that would damn some souls while saving others. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous postal rider who wouldn't meet Ezra's eyes. The envelope bore no return address, only Grace's name written in elegant script that seemed to mock the rural simplicity of the Whitmore Ranch. Inside, the message was brief but chilling. "My dear Grace, your education remains incomplete. Dr. B." Grace's reaction to seeing that handwriting confirmed their worst fears. She dropped the letter as if it were a flame, her face draining of color until she resembled a ghost of herself. For 3 days afterward, she refused to leave the house, positioning herself where she could watch all approaches to the ranch with the tactical awareness of a seasoned scout. Catherine found herself studying maps of Texas, calculating distances to Mexico, to the territories where federal law grew thin and a family might disappear into vastness. But Ezra's stubborn pride ran deeper than fear. This was his land, bought with blood and sweat, and no fancy doctor from Austin would drive him from it. The Whitmores fell into new routines born of necessity. Catherine taught Grace to load and fire the Winchester rifle, her steady nursing hands guiding the girl's trembling fingers. Grace proved an unnaturally quick study, her muscle memory seeming to recognize the weight and balance of weapons as easily as medical instruments. Within a week, she could place 3 shots within a silver dollar at 50 yards. Ezra assigned ranch hands to watch the perimeter in shifts, but sleep became elusive for all of them. Every night brought new sounds, hoofbeats that might be wind, shadows that could be men, the constant awareness that death might ride up their lane at any moment. The second letter came with a sheriff's deputy, a young man named Collins, who stuttered apologies as he delivered legal documents alongside Blackwood's correspondence. This time the message was longer, more detailed. Grace possesses rare medical training that makes her invaluable to advancing treatments for childless couples. Her return to proper medical supervision is not merely requested but legally mandated under territorial guardianship statutes. Sheriff Morrison arrived that evening, his weathered face grim with the weight of impossible choices. Jacob Morrison had worn the badge for 12 years, long enough to recognize the smell of corruption when it wafted in with official paperwork. "Ezra, I've known you since we were boys catching crawfish in the Guadalupe River," Morrison said, settling heavily into a porch chair. "You know I'd never do anything to hurt that girl if I had a choice in the matter." "But you don't have a choice," Ezra replied, reading the truth in his old friend's eyes. Morrison pulled out a flask, offering it first to Ezra, then taking a long pull himself. "Federal marshals coming down from Dallas next week. Got orders to transport Grace back to Dr. Blackwood's facility for what they're calling completion of her medical education. Judge Hartwell signed the custody transfer himself." Catherine appeared in the doorway. Grace pressed close behind her like a frightened shadow. "What if she doesn't want to go?" "Ma'am, with all due respect, what a 14-year-old girl wants doesn't carry much weight in territorial court, especially when a respected physician presents documentation showing she's his legal ward and medical apprentice." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Grace stepped forward, her young voice carrying the steel of someone who'd already lost everything once. "Sheriff Morrison, what did Dr. Blackwood tell you about his facility?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Said it was an orphanage with medical training programs, preparing young people for careers in healing arts." "Did he mention the children who died during those healing arts lessons? The ones buried in unmarked graves behind the main building?" Grace's eyes blazed with terrible knowledge. "Did he explain why children who arrived healthy often developed mysterious illnesses that required his special treatments?" The sheriff's flask slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. "Girl, you're talking about serious accusations against a man with powerful friends." "I'm talking about murder disguised as medicine," Grace replied with frightening calm. "I can draw you maps to every grave, tell you the names of children who supposedly found new families but never left that place alive. I can describe procedures that would make battlefield surgeons sick to their stomachs." Catherine moved protectively closer to Grace, her maternal instincts fully awakened. "Sheriff, this child has been tortured. Look at her scars, listen to her nightmares." "Is that the kind of education you're willing to send her back to?" Morrison stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing where he stared out at the darkening countryside. "Even if every word she's saying is true, I've got federal marshals coming with legal documents signed by territorial judges. What am I supposed to do? Start a shooting war with Washington over one girl?" "You're supposed to protect the innocent," Ezra said quietly. "Isn't that what the badge means?" The conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching horses. 3 riders emerged from the dusk, their silhouettes ominous against the dying light. The lead rider sat his horse with military precision, his uniform identifying him as a federal marshal. Behind him rode 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to buying whatever they desired. "Marshal Thompson," Sheriff Morrison called out, his voice carefully neutral. "You're earlier than expected." The marshal dismounted with economical movements, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. "Sheriff Morrison, we've come for the girl." One of the suited men stepped forward, his pale eyes finding Grace with predatory intensity. "My dear child, how you've worried us all. Dr. Blackwood has been beside himself with concern for your welfare." Grace pressed closer to Catherine, her training warring with newly awakened trust. The man's voice triggered memories of medical procedures conducted without consent, of children's screams echoing through sterile hallways, of gentle words spoken while inflicting unspeakable pain. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute conviction. The suited man smiled with the kind of warmth that never reached his eyes. "Grace, dear, you're still just a child. These good people have filled your head with fantasies, but Dr. Blackwood's work is sanctioned by the territorial government itself. You have skills, training that could save countless lives if properly directed." Ezra stepped between Grace and the federal agents, his rancher's frame suddenly seeming formidable despite the odds. "The girl says she doesn't want to go. In Texas, that ought to count for something." "In Texas, the law is what counts," Marshal Thompson replied coldly. "And the law says she's Dr. Blackwood's legal ward, trained at considerable expense for important medical work." Catherine's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What medical work requires terrifying children and burying failures in unmarked graves?" The second suited man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to ending conversations. "Ma'am, you're repeating wild accusations against a respected physician, Doctor. Blackwood's facility has saved hundreds of orphaned children, providing them with valuable skills and purposeful lives. By using them as test subjects for fertility experiments that kill more than they cure," Grace's voice gained strength as suppressed memories fought their way to the surface. "By telling desperate parents their dead children would help create perfect babies for wealthy couples who could afford miracles." The marshal's hand moved to his gun. "That's enough wild talk, girl. You're coming with us, and that's final." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 4 men with federal authority facing a rancher, his wife, and a traumatized child who'd already lost everything once. The mathematics of violence seemed inevitably weighted against the Whitmores, but Grace had spent months learning that family meant something different than survival. Marcus Whitmore's voice cut through the tension from the barn shadows. "Marshal Thompson, you might want to think twice before drawing that iron." The federal agent spun to find Marcus emerging from concealment, a rifle cradled casually in his arms, and a smile that promised unpleasant surprises. Behind him, 3 ranch hands materialized from positions that offered overlapping fields of fire. "Mister, I don't know who you think you are, but interfering with federal agents is a hanging offense," Thompson snarled. Marcus's smile widened. "Name's Marcus Whitmore, and I reckon you're about to have a very bad evening." He reached into his vest and produced a leather folder that made the marshal's face go pale. "Federal Agent Marcus Whitmore, Treasury Department, currently investigating irregularities in territorial medical contracts, and gentlemen, you've just walked into the middle of my case." The revelation hit like lightning striking twice in the same spot. Grace stared at Marcus with dawning understanding, while Ezra felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The questions, the suspicious timing of his visits, the way he'd immediately recognized Grace as something more than she appeared, it all made terrible sense. "Agent Whitmore," the marshal said carefully, "we weren't informed of any Treasury investigation." "That's because someone's been selling federal medical contracts to the highest bidder, regardless of qualifications or methods," Marcus replied, his casual demeanor belying the deadly seriousness of his words. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood's facility has been operating with federal funding while conducting procedures that violate every medical and legal standard this territory recognizes. The mathematics of the standoff had shifted dramatically, but Grace knew from bitter experience that powerful men rarely surrendered without inflicting maximum damage. Dr. Blackwood's influence reached too deep, his network too extensive for simple federal authority to deter him for long. As if summoned by her thoughts, another rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure whose elegant posture and unhurried pace suggested supreme confidence in his ability to control any situation. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had come to collect his wayward student personally. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood rode into the Whitmore ranch like death incarnate, his silver hair gleaming in the fading light, and his pale eyes surveying the scene with the cold calculation of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't solve through careful application of pain. At 55, he carried himself with the refined elegance of Eastern education and old money, his black suit immaculate despite the dusty ride from Austin. Grace's reaction was immediate and visceral. She collapsed against Catherine as if every bone in her body had turned to water, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The trained composure she'd maintained throughout the federal confrontation crumbled like a dam bursting under pressure. "My dear Grace," Blackwood called out in a voice like poisoned honey dismounting with fluid grace, "how you've worried us all. Such a long journey for such a young girl, and in the company of strangers, no less." Marshal Thompson stepped forward, clearly relieved to have reinforcement from someone with obvious authority. "Dr. Blackwood, we've encountered some resistance to the custody transfer. These folks seem to have filled the girl's head with wild stories." Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his pale eyes. "Marshal, you must understand that Grace has been through significant trauma. Orphaned children often create elaborate fantasies to cope with loss. It's quite common in my experience." Marcus Whitmore kept his rifle at the ready, his federal credentials having created a temporary stalemate. "Doctor, I'm investigating irregularities in your federal medical contracts. Perhaps you'd like to explain why children who enter your facility seem to have such high mortality rates." "Agent Whitmore, I presume?" Blackwood's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than accusations of murder. "I've heard about your investigation. Most thorough work, though I fear you've been misled by incomplete records and sensationalized accounts." The doctor reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with official documents. "I have here certificates of appreciation from 3 territorial governors, commendations from the Medical Board of Texas, and testimonials from dozens of families whose children have benefited from my programs." Sheriff Morrison examined the papers with the reluctant thoroughness of a man who recognized superior political connections. The seals looked authentic. The signatures belonged to men whose names carried weight from Austin to Washington. Whatever Blackwood's methods, he had clearly invested considerable effort in legitimizing them through proper channels. "Dr. Blackwood," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes, "perhaps you could explain to Grace why so many of her fellow students are buried behind your facility?" Blackwood's expression shifted to one of practiced sorrow. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can see that Grace has shared her trauma-induced fantasies with you. The children you reference died of the same diseases that killed their parents: typhoid, consumption, the various fevers that ravage the poor. My facility provided them with comfort in their final days and proper Christian burial when medicine could do no more." Grace found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "What about Thomas Crane? He was healthy when you started the iron treatments. What about Mary Sullivan?" "She could run faster than any of us until you began the blood experiments." "Grace, dear child," Blackwood replied with infinite patience, "fever can create such vivid hallucinations. The treatments you remember were efforts to save lives, not end them. that you survived when others didn't speaks to your remarkable constitution, not to any wrongdoing on my part." The manipulation was masterful, Catherine realized with growing horror. Blackwood spoke with the authority of medical expertise and legal legitimacy, while Grace's accusations sounded like the desperate fantasies of a traumatized child. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, her word meant nothing against his carefully constructed reputation. Ezra stepped protectively closer to Grace, his weathered hands steady despite the impossible odds they faced. "Doctor, the girl doesn't want to go with you. That ought to count for something in any decent man's calculations." "Mr. Whitmore, I sympathize with your attachment to Grace. She's a remarkable child, and I can understand how her presence might seem to fill a void in your childless household." Blackwood's words carried surgical precision, finding every emotional weakness with practiced ease. "But Grace requires specialized care for the trauma she's endured. My facility has resources and expertise that a cattle ranch, however well-intentioned, simply cannot provide." The federal marshal shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to resolve the situation and return to Austin. "Dr. Blackwood, we have the legal authority to take custody of the girl. These folks can't legally prevent it." "Of course not, Marshal, but I prefer to handle these matters with compassion whenever possible." Blackwood's pale eyes found Grace again, and she shrank further into Catherine's protective embrace. "Grace, surely you remember the good times at the facility. The education you received, the skills you learned, the purpose we gave to your life?" "I remember children screaming in the night," Grace replied, her voice gaining strength through desperation. "I remember you telling parents their dead children were necessary sacrifices for medical progress. I remember you saying God spoke through your hands while you killed." Blackwood's composure flickered for just a moment, revealing something cold and reptilian beneath his cultured exterior. "Grace has developed an unfortunate tendency toward dramatic exaggeration. Perhaps the isolation of ranch life has allowed these fantasies to grow unchecked." Marcus maintained his position, rifle ready, but his federal authority meant nothing if local law enforcement chose to support Blackwood's custody claim. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with Grace's fate hanging in the balance between conflicting jurisdictions and competing versions of truth. "I have a proposition," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man seeking compromise. "Grace is clearly attached to this family, and they to her. Perhaps we could arrange a gradual transition. She could spend summers at my facility, continuing her medical education while returning to the ranch during other seasons. It would provide the best of both worlds." The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but Grace's violent shaking revealed the trap hidden within the offer. Catherine recognized the manipulation. Blackwood was offering a compromise that would give him exactly what he wanted while appearing magnanimous to the federal agents. "No," Grace said with sudden, fierce clarity. "I won't go back. I won't help you hurt other children. I won't be part of your experiments anymore." "Grace, you're overwrought," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Perhaps Mrs. Whitmore could prepare some tea while we discuss this calmly. I have some medicinal herbs that might help settle your nerves." The casual mention of medicinal herbs sent alarm bells ringing through Catherine's nursing experience. She'd seen enough battlefield medicine to recognize when someone was suggesting chemical restraint disguised as comfort. "Doctor," she said carefully, "I think Grace has made her position clear. She's found a home here, people who care about her. Surely that's worth more than any medical training." Blackwood's smile grew broader, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "Mrs. Whitmore, you speak of caring, but do you truly understand what Grace represents? Her capabilities, properly directed, could revolutionize medical treatment for childless couples across the territory." Would you deny that gift to thousands of suffering families simply to satisfy your own maternal longings? The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Catherine felt the old pain surge through her. 15 years of failed pregnancies, of hope dying monthly, of watching other women hold babies that would never be hers. Blackwood had identified her deepest vulnerability and was using it as a weapon against Grace's freedom. "That girl has suffered enough," Ezra said firmly. "Whatever medical miracles you think she can perform, they're not worth torturing a child to achieve." "Torture?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you've misunderstood the nature of medical education. Yes, it can be demanding, even uncomfortable at times, but great advances require great sacrifices. Grace was chosen for this work, blessed with unique capabilities that could benefit all humanity." The standoff stretched taut as a piano wire, federal authority clashing with territorial law while a traumatized child's fate hung in the balance. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm that would match the violence brewing in human hearts. Grace suddenly pulled away from Catherine, standing alone in the center of the group with the desperate courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Tell them about the basement rooms. Tell them about the children who went down there and never came back up. Tell them what you really do to create your medical miracles." For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked completely, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath his cultured facade. The mask slipped from Dr. Blackwood's face like melting wax, revealing something inhuman beneath the cultured exterior. His pale eyes turned glacial, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "Grace, you always were too clever for your own good," he said, his hand moving with practiced ease to the medical bag secured to his saddle. "Marshal Thompson, I'm afraid the girl has suffered a complete psychological break. For everyone's safety, I'll need to sedate her for transport." The syringe appeared in his hand like a magician's trick, filled with clear liquid that caught the dying light with ominous promise. Grace recognized it immediately, the same compound that had turned rebellious children into docile subjects. The chemical leash that had kept dozens of young prisoners compliant during procedures that would have driven grown men mad. "Nobody's sedating anybody," Marcus Whitmore said firmly, his rifle swinging toward Blackwood. "Doctor, you're under federal investigation for misuse of territorial medical funds. I strongly suggest you return to Austin and await formal questioning." Blackwood laughed, the sound carrying no warmth or humor. "Agent Whitmore, your investigation was terminated 3 days ago. Surely you received the telegram from your superiors? Something about insufficient evidence and jurisdictional overreach." The color drained from Marcus's face. Federal investigations didn't simply disappear without warning, not unless someone with serious political power had decided they posed an inconvenient threat. Blackwood's influence reached deeper than any of them had imagined. "That's impossible," Marcus said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Nothing is impossible when proper channels are utilized," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Governor Richardson himself reviewed your findings and determined that territorial interests were better served by ending this particular inquiry. Federal oversight of local medical facilities was deemed excessive." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty torn between federal authority and territorial politics that could end his career with a single telegram. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavy as a millstone. Grace watched the adult world collapse around her with the detached calm of someone who had never expected salvation to last. She'd learned long ago that powerful men eventually got their way, that children's screams carried no weight against political connections and financial influence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood continued, his attention turning to Catherine with predatory focus, I understand your maternal instincts, but Grace requires specialized treatment that only my facility can provide. Her psychological condition has deteriorated significantly since her unfortunate departure. Catherine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her psychological condition? You mean the nightmares about children dying in your basement? The scars on her wrists from your medical instruments? The way she flinches every time someone mentions healing? Trauma manifests in many ways, Blackwood replied with clinical detachment. Grace has constructed elaborate fantasies to cope with the loss of her parents and her subsequent abandonment. My treatments were helping her distinguish reality from delusion before she ran away. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment even Catherine felt doubt creep into her certainty. This was how monsters succeeded, not through obvious evil, but through the careful construction of plausible alternatives to uncomfortable truths. Ezra stepped forward, his rancher's pragmatism cutting through the psychological manipulation. Doctor, if your treatments were helping, why did she run? Why does she react to your voice like a beaten dog hearing its master's footsteps? Mr. Whitmore, disturbed children often resist the very treatments that could save them. That's why institutional care requires proper restraints and medications to ensure patient compliance. Blackwood raised the syringe slightly, letting lamplight play across the needle. Grace's delusions have clearly worsened during her time away from proper medical supervision. Grace felt the familiar paralysis creeping up her spine, the learned helplessness that had kept her compliant through months of horrors disguised as healing. Part of her wanted to surrender, to accept that resistance was futile and powerful men always won in the end. But then Catherine's hand found hers, warm and steady and completely unafraid. The touch carried 15 years of frustrated maternal love, the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had finally found someone worth fighting for. In that moment, Grace understood that some battles were worth losing if they were fought for the right reasons. Dr. Blackwood, Grace said, her voice gaining strength with each word, tell them about Rebecca Martinez. 11 years old, died during your fertility treatments. Tell them about James Crawford, who you killed trying to extract bone marrow for your experiments. Tell them about— Enough! Blackwood's composure shattered completely, revealing the rage that had always lurked beneath his cultured facade. You ungrateful little wretch! I saved you from the streets, fed you, educated you, gave your miserable life purpose. The syringe gleamed in his hand as he stepped forward, no longer bothering to hide his intentions. Marshal Thompson, this child is clearly having a violent psychotic episode. I need to restrain her immediately before she harms herself or others. Marshal Thompson's hand moved to his gun, though whether to support or oppose Blackwood remained unclear. The federal agent found himself caught between conflicting authorities, territorial politics, and a growing certainty that something deeply wrong was unfolding before his eyes. Doctor, Thompson said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this situation in Austin with proper legal representation for all parties involved. There's nothing to discuss, Blackwood snapped. Grace Sullivan is my legal ward, trained at considerable expense for important medical work. These people have kidnapped her and filled her head with lies designed to turn her against legitimate authority. Sheriff Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. Dr. Blackwood, maybe the girl should have some say in where she goes. She's old enough to understand. She understands nothing. Blackwood's mask of civility disintegrated entirely. She's a damaged child who requires institutional control to prevent her delusions from becoming dangerous to herself and society. The transformation was complete. Gone was the refined physician with political connections and federal contracts. In his place stood something primitive and terrible. A predator whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled under pressure. Grace recognized this version of Blackwood from her worst nightmares. This was the man who had whispered gentle words while inflicting agony, who had spoken of divine purpose while conducting procedures that belonged in hell rather than any healing facility. "You see?" Grace said quietly, her young voice carrying the weight of terrible experience. "This is who he really is. This is what he becomes when children don't cooperate with his medical miracles." Catherine pulled Grace closer, her maternal instincts fully awakened by the threat to her adopted daughter. "Sheriff Morrison, are you really going to hand this child over to a man who's threatening her with forced medication?" Morrison looked from Blackwood's twisted features to Grace's terrified face, his conscience warring with political expedience. The badge on his chest represented justice, but the powers aligned against them represented survival in a world where federal investigations could be terminated with a telegram. Ezra made the choice for all of them. His weathered hand closed around the shotgun leaning against the porch rail, the metallic click of the safety being released cutting through the night air like thunder. "Doctor," he said with deadly calm, "I suggest you put that needle away and ride back to Austin while you still can. This is Texas, and we don't take kindly to men who threaten children on our land." The standoff crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. Federal agents, territorial law enforcement, a respected physician with political connections, and a traumatized child whose word meant nothing against institutional power, all balanced on the edge of violence that would change everything forever. Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with malevolent calculation as he weighed his options. The syringe remained steady in his hand, ready to end Grace's resistance permanently if circumstances provided the opportunity. "Mr. Whitmore," he said softly, "you're making a grave mistake. Grace belongs to me, trained by me, shaped by me for purposes you couldn't possibly understand. What happens next will determine whether she fulfills her destiny or dies trying to escape it." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, promising that tonight would end in blood regardless of who tried to prevent it. The truth arrived like lightning, splitting the Texas sky, illuminating everything in stark, terrible clarity. Grace's trembling voice cut through the standoff with words that would shatter every assumption they'd built about her past. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, her young face pale as winter moonlight, "tell them why you really want me back. Tell them about your wife Eleanor and the son who died because of your experiments." Blackwood's syringe-wielding hand froze mid-motion, his pale eyes widening with something that might have been genuine surprise. "Grace, you don't know what you're saying." "I know everything," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength from desperation. "I know about the smallpox outbreak in 1871 that killed your boy. I know about Eleanor hanging herself in the barn because she couldn't live with the guilt. I know why you started the fertility experiments." Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. The pieces were falling into place with horrible inevitability, painting a picture too monstrous to accept yet too detailed to dismiss. "Your son, Thomas," Grace pressed on, her memory unlocking secrets that had been buried for years. 7 years old when the fever took him. You couldn't save him with all your medical knowledge, so you decided to create perfect children who would never die of disease. Blackwood's composure cracked like an eggshell, revealing the broken man beneath the polished exterior. "Thomas he was everything to me. Eleanor and we tried for 12 years to have a child. When he finally came, he was perfect, beautiful, healthy. And then the smallpox came to Austin," Grace finished. "You tried everything, bleeding, mercury treatments, experimental compounds you'd read about in medical journals from back east. Nothing worked. Thomas died in agony while you held his hand, and Eleanor blamed herself for bringing him into a world where children suffered and died." Sheriff Morrison found himself leaning forward despite the danger, caught in the web of tragedy that was finally being revealed. "Dr. Blackwood, is this true?" Blackwood's laugh held no humor, only the bitter sound of a man who had stared into hell and decided to make it his home. True, Agent Whitmore wants truth. Thomas died because God made children weak, vulnerable to every disease that crawls across this God-forsaken earth. Eleanor died because she couldn't accept that our son's suffering had meaning, purpose. So, you decided to play God yourself, Marcus said grimly, his rifle still trained on the doctor but his expression shifting from anger to something approaching pity. I decided to perfect God's work, Blackwood corrected, his voice taking on the fervor of a man justifying the unjustifiable. Those children in my facility, they weren't victims. They were soldiers in a war against human frailty. Every death taught me something new about strengthening the human form, about creating children who could survive what Thomas couldn't. Grace's next revelation hit like a physical blow. You started with your own blood. You injected yourself with compounds designed to enhance fertility, to create children with stronger constitutions. But the experiments made you sterile instead. Catherine's nursing knowledge filled in the horrifying gaps. So you began using other people's children as test subjects, orphans no one would miss, children whose deaths could be explained away as natural causes. They died for a greater purpose, Blackwood said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Each failure brought me closer to success, closer to creating children who would never suffer as Thomas suffered. Ezra's weathered face hardened with disgust. You murdered children to ease your own grief. That's not medicine, doctor. That's madness. The accusation triggered something violent in Blackwood's demeanor. The syringe moved toward Grace with surgical precision, but Marcus's rifle shot exploded through the night before the needle could find its target. Blackwood screamed as the bullet shattered his wrist, sending the syringe spinning into darkness. "Federal agent!" Marcus shouted, though his authority had been compromised by Blackwood's earlier revelations about terminated investigations. "Drop your weapons!" Marshal Thompson drew his sidearm with reluctant efficiency, though his target remained unclear. The situation had devolved beyond normal law enforcement protocols, involving federal agents, territorial politics, and accusations that would require careful investigation to resolve. But Grace wasn't finished revealing secrets. Blood was flowing from Blackwood's shattered wrist, and the sight of it triggered memories that had been locked away for months. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible above Blackwood's groans of pain. The fertility treatments weren't random experiments. You were trying to recreate Thomas, using genetic material you'd preserved from his body. The words hit like blasphemy made manifest. Catherine felt her nursing instincts recoil from the implications, while Ezra's rancher's pragmatism struggled to process such unnatural obsession. "Grace, stop," Catherine whispered, recognizing that some truths were too terrible for the human heart to bear. But Grace couldn't stop. The floodgates had opened, and years of suppressed horror poured out like poison from a lanced wound. You kept samples of Thomas's blood, his tissue, pieces of his body that you used in experiments on living children. You thought you could bring him back by creating new children with his characteristics. Sheriff Morrison holstered his gun and stepped backward, his face pale with revulsion. Even federal authority had limits, and what Grace was describing exceeded every boundary of human decency. Blackwood clutched his wounded wrist against his chest, blood seeping between his fingers as he glared at Grace with the hatred of a man whose deepest secrets had been exposed to merciless light. "You don't understand," he snarled, his cultured accent dissolving into something more primitive. Thomas was perfect. He deserved to live, to grow up, to have children of his own. Those other children were damaged goods, street refuse that would have died anyway. I gave their deaths meaning. You gave their deaths nothing but pain. Grace replied with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. And the worst part is that Thomas would have hated what you became. He would have been ashamed to know his death inspired such evil. The words struck Blackwood like a physical blow. He doubled over, wounded wrist forgotten as emotional agony overwhelmed physical pain. For a moment the monster disappeared, leaving only a broken father who had lost everything and chosen the wrong path toward healing. Marcus kept his rifle trained on the doctor while processing the implications of what they'd learned. "Grace, how do you know all this? How could a child understand such details about medical experiments?" Grace's answer completed the picture with devastating clarity. "Because I wasn't just a student in his facility. I was his most successful experiment." She pulled back the sleeve of her dress, revealing scars that formed deliberate patterns along her arm. "I carry some of Thomas's genetic material in my blood, Doctor." Blackwood succeeded in creating what he thought was a perfect child, one who combined Thomas's characteristics with survival traits from other subjects. The revelation struck the group like lightning, illuminating the true horror of Grace's situation. She wasn't just a victim of Blackwood's experiments. She was their crowning achievement, a living fusion of his dead son and the children he'd murdered trying to resurrect him. Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet as she understood why Blackwood had pursued Grace with such obsessive determination. She wasn't just an escaped test subject. She was his attempt to bring his son back from the dead made manifest in living flesh. "That's why you can't let me go," Grace said, looking directly at Blackwood's pale, anguished face. "I'm not just carrying your medical secrets, I'm carrying Thomas. And you can't bear to lose him again." Blackwood's response was a sound no human throat should make, part grief, part rage, part the howl of a soul that had damned itself beyond any possibility of redemption. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were facing something far more dangerous than a corrupt physician or federal criminal. They were confronting a father's love twisted into something monstrous, a grief so profound it had warped reality itself and turned healing into horror, medicine into murder, and the natural order into an abomination that defied every law of God and man. The standoff had become something beyond law enforcement or federal authority. It was now a battle between the natural world and the unnatural obsessions that threatened to consume everything in their path. The resolution came not through violence, but through the quiet courage of broken people choosing to heal rather than harbor their wounds. Grace stepped forward, her young frame silhouetted against the lamplight, and did something that surprised everyone present. She knelt beside the wounded doctor who had tormented her for so long. "Dr. Blackwood," she said softly, her voice carrying no hatred, despite everything she had endured. "Thomas wouldn't want this. Your son wouldn't want other children to suffer because you couldn't save him." Blackwood looked up at her through eyes clouded with pain and the slow recognition of what he had become. Blood continued to seep from his shattered wrist, but the physical wound seemed insignificant compared to the spiritual damage that years of obsessive grief had inflicted. "You don't understand," he whispered, his cultured voice breaking. "He was everything good about Eleanor and me. When he died, it felt like God had made a mistake, like the universe had gotten the order wrong. The sick children lived while my perfect boy died." Catherine moved closer, her nursing instincts overriding personal revulsion. She began examining Blackwood's wounded wrist with professional detachment, applying pressure to stem the bleeding, while Grace continued her unlikely ministration to the man's wounded soul. "My parents died of fever too," Grace said simply. "I was angry for a long time. Angry at God, angry at death, angry at everyone who got to keep their families while mine was taken away. But anger didn't bring them back, and it didn't make me feel less alone." Sheriff Morrison holstered his weapon completely, recognizing that whatever was happening between the girl and the doctor transcended normal law enforcement. Marcus maintained his watchful position, but lowered his rifle slightly, sensing that the immediate physical threat was dissolving. "The difference," Grace continued, "is that I found people who loved me without trying to change me into someone else. The Whitmores didn't want me to replace a lost child. They wanted me to become myself." Blackwood's pale eyes found Ezra's weathered face, searching for something he couldn't name. "How?" he asked, the question directed more to the universe than to any individual present. "How do you love someone without trying to bring back what you've lost?" Ezra considered the question with the careful thoughtfulness of a man who had wrestled with similar demons. "I reckon love ain't about getting back what you lost, Doctor. It's about making room for what you find." The words seemed to hit Blackwood with unexpected force. His shoulders sagged as years of obsessive purpose finally cracked under the weight of simple human truth. The monster that grief had created began to dissolve, leaving behind a broken man who had forgotten how to heal instead of harm. "The children in my facility," Blackwood said, his voice barely audible. "The ones who died. They weren't Thomas. They were never going to be Thomas. They were just children who deserved to live their own lives." "Yes," Grace said simply. "And some of them did live because other people helped them escape. Some of them found families who loved them for who they were, not for who they might replace." Marshal Thompson stepped forward cautiously, his federal authority finally finding solid ground in the aftermath of revelation. "Dr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for violations of territorial law and federal medical statutes. But given your condition and the circumstances, I think medical treatment takes precedence over immediate custody." Marcus nodded agreement, his investigation finally vindicated despite political interference. "Sheriff Morrison, we'll need to secure the facility in Austin and document everything we find there. This is going to require extensive federal involvement." Morrison straightened his badge, duty finally clear after hours of moral confusion. "Agent Whitmore, you'll have full cooperation from territorial law enforcement. Whatever political pressure tried to shut down your investigation, it won't work twice." Catherine finished bandaging Blackwood's wrist with strips torn from her apron, her movements gentle despite everything he had done. "Doctor, your medical knowledge could still save lives if you chose to use it properly. Healing instead of experimenting, helping instead of harming." Blackwood stared at the improvised bandage, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "I haven't healed anyone in 15 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make something better instead of worse." Grace stood slowly, brushing dust from her dress with the practical movements of someone returning to normal life after extraordinary circumstances. "You could learn again. It's not too late to choose differently." The offer of redemption hung in the air like sunrise after the longest night. Blackwood looked around at the faces surrounding him, federal agents, local law enforcement, a ranching family, and the girl who had every reason to hate him but had chosen compassion instead. "The other children," he said, his voice gaining strength, "the ones still at the facility, the ones being held by my associates, they need to be freed. They need real families, real chances at normal lives." "That's exactly what's going to happen," Marcus assured him. "Your cooperation in identifying locations and accomplices will go a long way toward determining how the territorial court handles your case." Ezra placed a protective hand on Grace's shoulder, his rancher's pragmatism finally finding solid ground. "Grace, you'll always have a home here, no matter what happens next. You're family now, not because we need you to be someone else, but because you're exactly who you are." Catherine smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "We've all learned something about the difference between healing and fixing. Sometimes the broken things don't need to be made perfect. They just need to be loved." As dawn approached across the hill country, painting the sky in shades of hope and new beginning, the group began the practical work of dealing with the aftermath. Federal agents would investigate, territorial courts would prosecute, and a network of child exploitation would be dismantled piece by piece. But the real victory had already been won in the quiet moment when a traumatized girl chose forgiveness over revenge, when a grieving father chose healing over obsession, and when a childless couple discovered that family was built through love rather than blood. Grace Sullivan would grow up to become a respected teacher and advocate for orphaned children, using her medical knowledge to help rather than harm. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood would spend his remaining years as a prison physician, finding late-life redemption in genuine healing work. The Whitmore Ranch would become a sanctuary for rescued children, a place where damaged souls learned to trust again. Sheriff Morrison would be elected to 3 more terms, his reputation enhanced by choosing justice over political expedience. Agent Marcus Whitmore would receive federal commendation for exposing corruption that reached to the territorial capital. Marshal Thompson would testify before Congress about the need for stronger oversight of frontier medical facilities. But those were tomorrow's stories. Tonight, as the first light of dawn touched the Texas hills, a family sat together on their ranch house porch, an infertile rancher who had learned that fatherhood came through choice rather than biology, a former nurse who had rediscovered the meaning of healing, and a rescued girl who had finally found her way home. The hill country stretched endlessly around them, limestone bluffs rising like ancient promises against a sky that held infinite possibility. This was good land, hard-won land, but it had finally found the people worthy of its promise. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully while the sun rose on a day when justice had triumphed over power, when love had overcome obsession, and when the simple truth that every child deserved safety and family had proven stronger than all the forces arrayed against it. Grace Sullivan had been rescued from child labor, but in the end, she had rescued everyone else from the prisons of their own pain. That perhaps was the greatest miracle of all. Sometimes the greatest gifts in life come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. At 68, maybe you've felt that hollow ache that comes with watching dreams slip away. Children who never came, grandchildren you'll never hold, a legacy that feels incomplete. Ezra and Catherine Whitmore knew that pain intimately after 15 years of failed hopes and monthly heartbreak. But when a desperate rancher spent $50 at a child labor auction, he discovered something profound. Family isn't about blood or biology, it's about choosing to love unconditionally. That traumatized 14-year-old girl didn't just find a home, she became the daughter they never knew they needed, and they became the parents she deserved. In our golden years, we often think our time for making a difference is past, that meaningful connections are behind us. But Grace's story reminds us that it's never too late to open our hearts, extend our tables, and discover that the most profound joy comes not from what we've lost, but from what we choose to embrace. The Hill Country Ranch became a sanctuary, not because it was perfect, but because it was filled with people willing to see potential instead of problems, hope instead of heartbreak. Have you ever found unexpected family in the most unlikely places? What moment taught you that love is a choice, not just a feeling? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.